All right, AP people, let's go through China here. And the purpose of this little recording here is just to help you understand the really complicated transition of China over to communism because there's so many factors at work. So contextually, we just want to back up and think about all the things that are going on in the world for China. So first of all, we have to think about the Qing dynasty and its legacy and how they were viewed as foreign leaders and how they constantly let other powers take control of China, all the uprisings and violence that happened under their rule. And it was a really brutal decline of the Qing dynasty. Then we have to think about how China is impacted, by foreign occupation, the world wars. And so we're going to go through all of that and kind of answer the question of why would China choose communism over moving towards democracy? So here we go. One of the things to remember is that first of all, before World War II, but Japan is going to occupy and try to colonize China and keep them as a tribute state, which is a real flip in human history, right? So China's going to suffer greatly from the violence inflicted by Japan and the occupation during that time period. And so we have that going on. What I want you to think about inside China is that there's a real question to be asked then as the Qing dynasty is toppled following World War I is what are we going to? And then you've had kind of this foreign occupation of China for a couple centuries now. So in that power vacuum, who's going to emerge? That's going to be a real internal struggle. So in China, it can be a little bit complicated. So let's think about who actually is involved in this struggle. So first of all, the transition to freedom, we have rebels. So this would be anybody that's opposing the Qing dynasty. So that can include a lot of people. We have nationalists. So these would be people that are Western in ideas. So they might want constitutional government, civil rights, parliamentary form of government. And so Sun Yat-sen is the leader of this movement. However, in Chinese history, we always know that there's a power of warlords or regional rulers. And so we do have that. Obviously, those people are going to want to go to more autocratic system, maybe go back to dynastic rule if that works. And so we see the struggle inside China for what side is going to win out. So going through chronologically here, you can just read the slide and you can see that that Sun Yat-sen and the nationalists temporarily seize power. Then they're challenged by internal struggle with the regional warlords, and they are actually going to seize power temporarily. Again, remember this is a lot of back and forth. However, the nationalists are going to reorganize and form an alliance with a new leader now, and that's Chiang Kai-shek. So that's the guy we'll be talking about. So it goes rebellion against the Qings, then the nationalists take over, then the warlords take over, or the regional rulers. Now back to the nationalists. Well, now we have an ongoing internal dialogue in China of, do we want nationalists and do we want Western forms of government? And that's a really important question because you can see why in China and other parts of Asia, they're basically like, I don't know if we want Western forms of government because that hasn't really worked out too well for us so far. So now there's an internal struggle in China once the warlord and the regional rulers have been limited. So it's kind of like, well, what is going to work for China and what is the true expression of, how we can rule this country? So now we're going to enter a long conflict between the communists and the nationalists. So we need to remember Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, who is the leader of the communist groups. So one important thing to know is that Chiang Kai-shek is Western educated. He's also backed by Western powers. But Chiang Kai-shek and his followers were like some of the other leaders that we supported during this time, where they are not necessarily, they are more pro-Western than they are pro-China. And so the people of China will watch them take on this kind of Western foreign flavor. They're kind of urban-based, intellectual-based, and not really democratic and not really working for the benefit of the people. So there's growing skepticism about Chiang Kai-shek among the peasantry and the masses. And that is where Mao Zedong is going to grow his support. Now, interestingly, although they are undergoing this civil war in China between the nationalists and the communists, temporarily they do join sides to fight against Japan and to organize against Japan in Japanese occupation and to help fight them off in World War II. However, as soon as World War II is over, you can see why that coalition is going to fall apart. And the long story short is that the communists end up winning. So I do want to talk a little bit about some of that back and forth, just so you have some contextual understanding for all of this. So the May 4th movement, I think, is something that you could see come up maybe like in a document. And this was a university movement and an intellectual movement to transition Japan over to liberal government. So we're kind of going back to the beginning of the nationalist versus communist part. And in China, we have to think about like it's old power versus new power. And so I think that the Chinese people and the Chinese society, this is a real struggle because the old ways didn't necessarily perform well against Western nations, but you don't necessarily want to be Western. So this just goes chronologically. It's kind of a repeater of the last slide, but it's just going to go chronologically through the periods of the 20th century and how it ends up communist. So again, we see the fall of the Qing dynasty. We see the nationalists. We see the warlord. Nationalists again challenged by the communists, but then they team up to get rid of Japan. And now we see that this final struggle, the nationalists are defeated by the communists. So I think the question is, why do they fail? So one of the reasons that they're going to fail is that the nationalists, because like I said, they are considered Western backed, they are not considered to be peasant friendly. And we know that peasants are numerous in China and it can be a powerful force. So really the people are going to ally with Mao Zedong and the communists, not out of pure devotion to communist theory, but seeing it as a true expression of the Chinese people and not Western backed. So one of the famous incidents back in 1934, there was a long march. This was when the communists were almost completely defeated in China, where there was this 1,000-mile journey where the nationalists were pursuing the communists. And the story goes that all along the way, like the nationalists were like taking from the peasants and stealing from the peasants, but the communists would interact with the peasants, pay the peasants for their crops. And so like this is just the beginning of communism being defined as the new Chinese nationalism and what the people want. So all in all, this internal struggle, we want to just remember that China transitioned over through this internal struggle that was very long, very complicated. They really had to answer the question of what is Chinese nationalism? How do we unify? And do we want to go the nationalist route? And for all the factors that I talked about, really, Mao Zedong and the communists are able to secure the support of the people and grow a critical mass, and they are able to defeat the nationalists. And post World War II then, so immediately following World War II, as of 1948, this whole internal struggle is done and China is going to go communist. Now, there's some controversy because Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, as they were being pursued in this final months where everything was collapsing for the nationalists, they flee to Taiwan. So Taiwan is the island you can see here in this little thing. Taiwan is this island off the coast of China. And so he's fleeing there and he's setting up the nationalist government there. And this is considered temporary. Okay. So even today, then Taiwan is contested territory because Taiwan continues to operate as a claimed independent state, but China views it as a rogue region. So there is heavy disagreement about Taiwan in Asia. It's a source of contention between the United States and China and other countries in China, because if countries recognize Taiwan and the leaders of Taiwan, then China gets super angry. And so it's a dance that world leaders play even to this modern day. One of the things that we'll do when we get done talking about the whole transition to communism in China is think about like, how is communism different between the USSR and China? And there's some pretty strong similarities and differences. So when we take a look at both revolutions and how they transition to communism, let's talk about the differences first. First of all, the proletariat in Russia, like who is being oppressed? It's the urban poor and the peasants to some degree, right? But the fighters are like these small organized cells that are able to overwhelm. The bourgeoisie, these would be like the foreign-backed nobles and also the people that supported the czar. It was pretty quick, and we know that the leader is Lenin. In China, however, I mean, think about how long this internal struggle takes. It's a very lengthy The proletariat, so these are the people being oppressed by the system. It's not, remember, China didn't undergo industrialization. So this is not urban poor. This is literally being redefined. So communist and communist theology in China is more of China as a whole is the proletariat, and they are being oppressed by foreign powers and foreign occupation. And so now you can see why the whole communist narrative actually makes sense for the Chinese people who are trying to achieve independence and freedom from foreign control. Okay, there's greater mass following in China. Again, the bourgeois, who are they fighting? They're fighting Western powers and their puppets, Chiang Kai-shek. And the leader, of course, is Mao Zedong. Now, what is similar is that the West is going to intervene, right? So in both struggles, Western nations try to prop up the nationalist leader, but fail. That should have taught us lessons. But, it took us half a century, basically, to realize we can't prop up leaders that people won't ultimately support. In two phases, right? Like first you have to topple the empire, then have an internal struggle between nationalist liberal government versus communist government. Both sides are unhappy about the world wars. Another similarity I want to talk about, maybe just with the outcome that's not written on the slide there, is both of them do transition over to a command economy or a communist. So the communist theology of who versus who is different between the two, but the economic approaches and the adoption of communist economic policies actually are adopted by both. Russia and China are going to be partners in the Cold War until 1960, and then there's a little bit of a falling out. So we'll talk about that in class, but hopefully that back and forth will help you. Now, these are some self-check questions, like really the back and forth of the communist revolution in China is not a huge area of emphasis, but we definitely want to know the difference between the communists and the nationalists, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, and also just understanding how communism in theology, meaning its core beliefs and its defining beliefs, is different in China compared to Russia. So I hope that helps you a little bit understand the nuance of this whole revolution and transition to communism in China, the length of it, the brutal nature of it. I guess I didn't go into deaths as we go through that, but we can think about, if you think about last century and all the deaths that took place in China with the Taiping Rebellion, which, they're estimated between 20 and 40 million people dying. Think about the Boxer Rebellion, wasn't quite as deadly, but then also just the world wars, the occupation by Japan, and then all of this internal struggle that's going on at this time. The devastation for China is pretty hard for us to even wrap our brains around. Hundreds, possibly up to 100 million Chinese citizens that died in conflict, internal or external. So that's a pretty big deal. Our next step is just to take a look at Mao Zedong and how his policies impacted the actual people of China. Did they like communism after it was instituted? And how do you break down old power in China? What is old power for Mao Zedong? And how is he going to eradicate? I mean, China has 2,000 years of dynastic history. China has such a long history of Confucian values. Like, do Confucian values and communist values align? So there are some difficult questions ahead. It's not smooth sailing for Mao Zedong, and that's our next lesson.